On today's topic, hopefully you can hear me because I'm gonna have to fight against these announcements that happen in 2 seconds.
30 minutes prior to your departure time. Please make sure to
So today I wanted to talk about duality and paradoxes.
Thank you.
And the reason I wanted to talk about duality and paradoxes is because we're in a weird time, right? Where we're like questioning humanity a bit, Like how are these things happening and this is happening? So for example, how is all these crazy, terrible situations are happening, and at the same time, how do I continue to have compassion? That's the duality and the paradox of life. So that's what I'm going to get into. So what is duality? Duality is the idea of yes and, right? It's that two concepts can or do coexist with each other. But what about paradoxes? So paradoxes is the idea that two opposing concepts coexist. And you say, damn, that's wild. Like, how can that be? How can those two things be happening at the same time, right? And it confuses us a little bit. So I believe that if you resist to understand these two concepts, that you'll experience a lot more suffering in your life. And so how do you embrace these concepts when shit is real out here in the streets, right? A lot is going on, both in our own personal lives, but also around the world. Like, how do you manage those dual emotions or multiple emotions? And honestly, the world needs a lot of healing right now, more than ever, right? And there's a massive battle happening between good and evil, light and dark. And so because of this, you have to find a way to remain really centered, emotionally grounded, and not swept up by fear and all the other stuff that's going on in the world. And, again, all this has to do with you already dealing with your own personal stuff. When I walked away from social work in 2013, I thought to myself, I want to be oblivious from the dark side. I don't want to hear any more traumatic or horrific or heartbreaking stories. I want to be like everybody else, going about my business, not knowing and not having a clue that these things existed, like these things were out there like that. Like there was this really bad stuff happening. And so for a while, I went into a bubble. And when I realized that perspective didn't serve me, it wasn't helpful. It didn't help me to manage the hard stuff. And so I had to pop my own bubble. Okay. And so a few years back, I came across this book. It's called The 5 Things We Cannot Change. I highly recommend it, especially if you have a hard time really dealing with the things that you can't change, like the things that are just inevitable. It's a really good read. And so I want to say briefly that sometimes, and I don't know if y'all experience this, but sometimes there are things happening to us. We have a hard time articulating it. And then you read a book or you have a conversation with somebody, and then you're like, boom, that's exactly what I was trying to say. So this book was that for me. After I read it, I was like, oh my God, this had everything that I really wanted to articulate. I just didn't know how. And it talked about embracing the paradoxes of life. And, I started thinking about how some of us are living in an all or nothing kind of world, as if everything was black and white, and we're not able to hold space between the stuff that's in between, right? Like that gray area. We have a hard time just sitting there and feeling grounded in it. So ultimately, the space in between is what we want to understand, because the world isn't always so easily understood in a black and white format. And sometimes, the world can be pretty damn murky. But in all honesty, we're going to have painful and beautiful things happening to us, sometimes all at once, right? So how do you maintain your sanity in such a paradoxical world? How do you live in dualities? And I believe when you're able to be open about and curious about the paradoxes, you're able to navigate life with a little bit more grace. And so, for instance, can you remain compassionate in a world that sometimes shows you it lacks compassion? Can you still love even when your heart is broken? You notice this like glare. It's terrible. Let me go this way. Sorry, guys. Yeah. Can you still love even if your heart has been broken? Are you able to trust despite the fact that people have abused it? That's duality. Those are paradoxical situations, right? And so when I was knee deep in social work, in my social work career, I had to find compassion for a lot of different kinds of people. And I remember one client specifically in mind that I'll never forget. And she had a long history of substance use. And no matter how hard that we tried, the drugs dominated her life. And that had consequences, and she lost her kids. And so, substance use is very complex. I don't want to get into that. But the challenge for me at the time, and this is what I want to focus on, the challenge for me at the time was, how do I hold compassion for this woman? Especially, I'm a mom as well, and I couldn't relate to her, but I had to somehow find compassion because I saw her all the time. I saw her every month. I saw her kids. So that was difficult for me, and I knew that doing this kind of work, I had to be able to live in that in-between space, and I had to find a way to be comfortable in that space. Not comfortable in the sense like I resign myself, but like comfortable that I can move about and it doesn't disrupt my life. Because what happens is when you get stuck in that all or nothing, you find yourself stuck in situations and you're not able to make any forward motion. So anyway, I got a little sidetracked, but at times it was, again, a real struggle for me to see humanity. And sometimes even to this day, like I'd be like, damn, I struggle with it sometimes and I have to find my way back again consciously, right? And so to be able to see this person as human and send love and compassion their way, what is what we're challenged here to do in general, right? So what do you do? Right? This is all good in theory. And I believe the best way to begin this process is to first be realistic. And just because you're realistic, it doesn't mean it eliminates your desire to be optimistic, right? You can still be realistic and optimistic. Again, dualities, right? How do we hold these two spaces? How do we coexist with these two spaces? And so once you're rooted in reality and you come from that place of absolute truth, you slowly begin to accept the dualities of life. Some people do this by, working with a professional, a spiritual guide, and by practicing mindfulness, things of that nature, meditation. Choose whatever medium works for you. I know that some days we don't want to think about the real shit, right? Especially with how the world is right now, but we have to. And we do this so it doesn't keep us hostage in some sort of illusion, right? It doesn't mean that we remain fixated and this is all we think about. It just means that we accept its presence. And through that acceptance, we can fully embrace life. And again, if you have a hard time with this, it's really going to get in the way of your forward progression. So let's rewind a little bit because I gave you a bunch of concepts that might be a little bit difficult to digest. But first, accept the dualities of life. And you do this through practice. And you could do this through faith, through logic, through writing, through the help of a professional, however you do it, just as long as you get the process going. Then you move on. And I'll give you a quick example without getting too morbid, but the fact of life is we are impermanent, right? And how do you reconcile with something like that? How do you reconcile with a thought like that? And for me, I went on a journey, a spiritual journey, and I started to explore different kinds of spirituality. So I started to lean heavily towards Buddhism. And not that I'm a Buddhist, but some of the teachings and philosophies have helped me to really be grounded in what I find to be inevitable, things that I cannot change. And so when I think about dualities and paradoxes, I think about how dualities lead you to all truths. They help you step outside of the world of illusions. They help you see when, for example, anger surfaces, but so does compassion and empathy and love. All of these notions need the other to exist so that we can experience them fully. And it's important because you can fully drop your armor, you can fully free yourself from anxieties and any other emotional and mental turmoil that you might be experiencing. So this is why it is so important for you to go through that process. I meet a lot of my clients who really have a hard time with this, and a lot of that is like letting go, surrender, and I talk a lot about these things because they're critical to your own personal emotional growth. Okay. All right, so that's all I got. I realized I didn't even introduce myself in the beginning. My name is Francis. I'm a trained therapist, also life coach, and I help women to remove emotional barriers, emotional blocks that they can thrive. Essentially, all my content is all about removing barriers so that you can thrive and live a life of meaning and purpose. Okay, you can find me hanging out at defineresistance.com. Feel free to sign up to my newsletter where I get more intimate with my audience. And that's it. Thank you for indulging me this time around. And I'm out like a light. Peace.